The hospital was already loud before the sun went down. Stretchers rolled across the shiny floor. Phones rang without pause. Nurses moved quickly from one room to another, checking charts, adjusting drips, calming worried families. It was the kind of evening where no one looked at the clock, because there was simply no time. Among all the movement was a nurse who had worked there for almost 8 years. She was not the loudest person in the room. She did not try to impress anyone. She tied her hair back the same simple way every shift and wore her uniform without decoration. Most people noticed her only when they needed something. She noticed everything. She noticed when a patient's breathing changed slightly before the monitor showed it. She noticed when a family member was pretending to be strong but was close to breaking down. She noticed when young nurses felt overwhelmed but were too shy to ask for help. Still, during meetings and rounds, her voice often faded into the background. Senior doctors discussed treatment plans quickly, using heavy medical words. When she gently offered suggestions, they were sometimes brushed aside with a short nod or distracted. Yes, we'll handle it. She learned not to take it personally. The hospital had its own rhythm, and she had accepted her place in it. The most respected surgeon in the building was known for his sharp mind and steady hands. Patients waited months for his appointments. Medical students followed him around like shadows, hoping to learn even one small trick from him. He carried himself with confidence, almost like he carried the entire hospital on his shoulders. Their interactions were always professional but brief. He would give instructions, and she would carry them out carefully. Sometimes you wanted to add something, but his pace was fast and firm. There never seemed to be room for extra words. That evening felt no different at first. She was finishing paperwork at the nurse's station when the doors of the emergency department burst open. Paramedics rushed in, pushing a stretcher quickly. The sound of wheels rolling fast against the floor made everyone look up. Car accident, one of the paramedics said, slightly out of breath. Severe impact. Lost a lot of blood at the scene. The patient on the stretcher was unconscious. Her face was pale, her hair tangled from the crash. There was something fragile about her stillness that made the room feel heavy. The nurse stood up immediately and moved toward the trauma bay. Her steps were calm, but her mind was already working ahead. She began checking the patient's vitals as the doctors gathered. Then something unexpected happened. The surgeon walked in, ready to take charge as he always did. But the moment he saw the patient's face, his expression changed. The confidence that usually rested in his eyes disappeared. He froze. For a second, no one understood why. Then he stepped closer, his voice suddenly unsteady. That's my wife. The words hung in the air like a shockwave. The room fell silent before exploding into motion again. Nurses exchanged quick glances. The junior doctors looked confused. No one had expected this. The surgeon had always been private about his personal life. Many staff members did not even know what his wife looked like. Now she was lying in front of them, injured and fighting for her life. His hands trembled for just a moment before he forced himself to focus. Years of training pushed him forward. "Prepare the operating room," he said firmly, though his voice carried strain beneath it. The nurse watched him carefully. She had never seen him like this. Behind the controlled tone, she could see fear, deep personal fear. As they moved the patient towards surgery, the nurse walked beside the stretcher. She kept her eyes on the monitors, noting every number. Blood pressure low, pulse weak but present, breathing shallow. Inside, she felt the weight of the moment. This was not just another emergency. This was different. In the operating room, bright lights turned on. The team moved quickly, preparing tools and equipment. The air felt tense, almost tight. The surgeon scrubbed in, his movements automatic but slightly rushed. One of the other doctors quietly suggested that maybe someone else should lead, given the situation. But he shook his head. "I can do this," he said. "I have to." No one argued further. The nurse stood in her position, ready to assist. She had been part of hundreds of surgeries. She knew how emotions could affect even the best professionals. She reminded herself to stay steady, no matter what happened. As the procedure began, the surgeon focused intensely. His skill was clear. His hands were precise, controlled. For a while, everything moved smoothly. But the nurse noticed something small. The patient's blood pressure dipped again, just slightly. It was not dramatic enough to cause panic. The monitors beeped in their usual rhythm. Still, something felt off. She leaned closer to check the readings herself. She adjusted a line gently and observed the response. Her mind went through possibilities quickly. She opened her mouth to speak, then hesitated. The room was already tense. The surgeon's jaw was tight. Sweat gathered at his temple. She chose her words carefully. "Doctor," she said softly, "her pressure is dropping a little more than expected." "I see it," he replied without looking up. "Continue the fluids." She nodded, but the uneasy feeling stayed with her. The surgery continued. Minutes passed, but they felt longer. Outside the operating room, hospital staff whispered quietly. News had already begun to spread that the surgeon's wife had been brought in. Some staff members stood near the hallway, waiting for updates. It was not common for such personal tragedy to enter their professional space so suddenly. Inside, the nurse stayed focused. She watched not just the monitors, but the small details, the color of the patient's skin, the way her chest rose and fell, the response to each adjustment. She thought about how many times she had been in this exact position, standing beside a surgeon who carried authority in the room. She respected that authority, but she also knew her own experience. Another small change caught her attention. The numbers were not alarming yet, but they were moving in the wrong direction. She felt a quiet determination grow inside her. This was not about hierarchy. This was about the woman on the table. She glanced at the surgeon. For the first time, she saw not just a leader, but a husband trying not to fall apart. His focus was strong, but emotion flickered behind his eyes. The nurse took a slow breath. This night was far from over. And somewhere deep inside, she sensed that before it ended, she would have to make a choice. To stay silent like always, or to speak with strength no one in that room had ever seen from her before. The air inside the operating room felt heavier as the minutes passed. Everyone was doing their job, but no one could ignore the truth. The patient on the table was not just another case. She was a surgeon's wife. He kept his eyes fixed on the surgical field, forcing his breathing to stay steady. Years of experience guided his hands. Normally, he spoke with calm authority, giving short, clear instructions. Tonight, his voice carried an edge. Not anger, but fear hiding beneath control. The nurse stood beside him, passing instruments at the exact second he needed them. She had worked with him long enough to understand his rhythm. But tonight, the rhythm was slightly off. A fraction too fast. A fraction too tense. The monitors continued their steady beeping. At first, it sounded normal. But she noticed something small again. The patient's blood pressure dipped lower than before. Not dangerously low yet, but trending downward. She adjusted the flow and checked the medication dosage carefully. Everything matched the chart. Still, the numbers did not respond the way she expected. "Pressure is falling again," she said quietly. "I'm aware," he replied, his focus unbroken. "We're controlling the main bleed." She nodded, but her eyes stayed on the screen. Another doctor on the team glanced at the monitor, then at the surgeon. No one wanted to question him directly. He was the best, and this was personal. The nurse felt a quiet conflict building inside her. She respected him deeply. She knew what he was capable of, but she also knew what she was seeing. The patient's skin looked paler under the bright lights. Her pulse was becoming weaker. The surgeon asked for another instrument. His voice was sharper now. A thin layer of sweat had formed on his forehead. Outside the operating room, the hallway was still crowded. A few staff members tried to look busy, while clearly waiting for updates. Some whispered about how difficult this must be for him. Others simply hoped for good news. Inside, the nurse leaned slightly closer to the monitor. Her heart beat faster, but her hands stayed steady. She replayed the patient's condition in her mind. The car accident, the reported blood loss at the scene, the injuries they had identified so far. Something did not fully add up. She noticed a subtle swelling near the abdomen that had not been as visible before. Her thoughts sharpened. "Doctor," she said again, a little firmer this time, "there may be additional internal bleeding." He paused for half a second. "We've addressed the visible damage," he answered. "Stay focused." The words were not harsh, but they closed the conversation. She swallowed her concern and continued assisting, but she did not stop thinking. The monitor let out a sharper sound. Blood pressure dropped suddenly. The room shifted from tense to urgent in an instant. "Why is it falling?" one of the junior doctors asked. The surgeon worked faster, trying to identify the cause. His movements became more forceful, less fluid. The nurse's instincts grew louder in her mind. She had seen this pattern before in other patients. Hidden internal bleeding that was not immediately obvious. The body trying to compensate until it simply could not anymore. She stepped slightly forward. "We need to check for a secondary source," she said clearly. There was a brief silence. The surgeon's jaw tightened. "I said we're handling it." The tension in the room was thick now. No one spoke. The only sound was the monitor's uneven beeping. The nurse felt heat rise in her chest. Not anger, but urgency. This was no longer about being heard. It was about time. She looked directly at the screen again. The numbers were slipping further. Another doctor shifted nervously. "Maybe we should take a closer look," he said carefully. The surgeon hesitated. Just for a second. That second felt long. Then the patient's heart rate spiked before dipping again. "Pressure is critical," the nurse said, her voice steady but strong. The surgeon finally looked up at the monitor fully. The reality hit him. His breathing changed. "All right," he said quickly. "We'll reassess." The team adjusted position. The nurse assisted in repositioning the surgical focus. As they examined more carefully, the hidden issue became clearer. There was internal bleeding that had not been fully visible at first. The nurse felt both relief and worry at the same time. Relief that the cause was now identified. Worry that precious minutes had already been lost. The surgeon's expression shifted. He knew what this meant. He knew he had resisted too quickly. "Prepare suction," he instructed. She handed it to him immediately. The room moved in coordinated urgency now. The earlier hesitation was gone. Everyone understood the seriousness of the situation. The nurse worked without hesitation. Her earlier doubts had turned into focused action. She anticipated each need before it was spoken. The bleeding was heavier than expected. The surgeon's hands were still skilled, but emotion flickered across his face. This was not just another patient whose chart he would sign later. This was the person he went home to, the person who shared his quiet mornings and late-night talks. For the first time, fear showed clearly in his eyes. The nurse noticed. In that moment, she did not see a famous surgeon. She saw a husband who was terrified of losing someone he loved. The monitor gave another sharp alarm. "Stay with us," one of the doctors muttered under his breath, almost like a prayer. The nurse leaned closer, her voice calm. "We can stabilize this. We just need to move quickly." This time, he did not dismiss her. He nodded once. They worked together in intense silence. The room felt smaller, as if the walls had moved closer. Every second carried weight. Gradually, the bleeding slowed. The numbers on the monitor stopped falling. Not safe yet, but no longer dropping. The nurse did not relax. She kept watching closely. Small adjustments. Careful monitoring. The surgeon exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding his breath for several minutes. "Good catch," the other doctor said quietly, almost to himself. The nurse heard it, but she did not respond. Her attention stayed on the patient. The crisis was not over, but they had crossed a dangerous point. As the procedure continued, the atmosphere in the room changed. It was still serious, still intense. But something else had shifted too. The surgeon's tone softened. "Let me know immediately if you see anything else," he said, not looking at her but clearly meaning it. She gave a small nod. For the first time that night, he was not just commanding, he was listening. Outside, the hallway remained quiet. No one knew how close things had come to slipping away. Inside, the nurse remained steady, her focus unwavering. She understood something deeply in that moment. Respect is not demanded in loud voices. It is earned in quiet actions. The surgery was still far from finished. But now, the team was truly working together. And in the middle of fear and flashing monitors, something important had begun to change. Not just in the patient condition, but in the balance of trust inside that room. The operating room felt electric, charged with tension and focus. Every person in the room moved like a part of a single machine, their actions precise and deliberate. Even the youngest nurses seemed older tonight, their hands steady despite the fear that pulsed through the room. The surgeon, the most skilled person in the building, worked quickly, but there was a softness in his movements, a hidden tremor that no one else would have noticed if not for the quiet observer beside him. The nurse watched him carefully. She had been part of countless surgeries before, yet tonight felt different. She had seen fear before, yes, but never so personal. This was not just a patient on a table. This was someone the surgeon loved more than anyone else. Someone who had shared his life outside the hospital walls. She realized that fear could shake even the strongest hands, but experience and calm thinking could save a life. The patient's blood pressure was fluctuating again. It had stabilized briefly, but now it was dropping in a way that alarmed even the junior doctors. The nurse's eyes moved quickly between the monitors and the patient. Her hands were calm, almost serene, but her mind raced. Every second counted. She noticed a subtle swelling in the patient's abdomen. It was small, but enough to worry her. She leaned slightly closer to the surgeon, her voice firm but respectful. "Doctor, I think we need to check for internal bleeding in the lower quadrant. It could be the source of the pressure drop." The surgeon's hands paused for a moment. His gaze flicked toward her, and she saw the hesitation in his eyes. He had been so focused on the known injuries that he had not yet considered the hidden ones. The fear was still there, but now there was also trust, fragile but growing. "All right," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "Check it." Another doctor helped with the examination, and the nurse moved efficiently, guiding their actions. They worked quickly, and soon the hidden bleed was visible. It was worse than expected. Blood had collected in a pocket, hidden from view, and now it had to be dealt with immediately. The tension in the room climbed again. "Prepare the suction clamps," the surgeon said, his voice now steady but firm. His hands were precise. This was the part he was trained for, the part where skill met life-saving necessity. But his eyes kept flicking to the nurse, silently acknowledging her observation. The nurse passed each instrument as needed, anticipating his moves. She adjusted medication lines, monitored vitals, and kept her mind racing ahead to what could happen next. The room worked as one unit, but she felt a weight that no one else carried. The unspoken knowledge that every second mattered, that any mistake could cost a life. The surgeon worked on the visible bleed, while the nurse and other doctors managed the rest. Her calm guidance allowed the surgeon to focus on his part without distraction. They communicated with brief nods, quick words, and shared glances. No one else spoke much. They were all aware that this moment required absolute focus. The patient's condition began to stabilize, but only slightly. Every small adjustment mattered. The nurse noted the color of her skin, the subtle changes in pulse, the tension in her chest muscles. She checked every line and tube, double-checked every dosage. The numbers on the monitor were improving, but she knew they were still in danger. Time seemed to stretch. Minutes felt like hours. The surgeon's jaw was tight, his hands still steady but his heart racing. He glanced at the nurse, and for the first time that night, there was a small nod of recognition. She was not just a helper. She was a crucial part of saving his wife's life. The monitor beeped irregularly. Blood pressure dipped again. The surgeon's hands moved faster, but his eyes flickered with fear. The nurse stepped closer, placing a gentle hand on a line and adjusting it. Her voice was calm, almost soothing. "We can stabilize this. Just need to manage the secondary bleed carefully." He took a slow breath, trusting her judgment. He had been the leader for so long. But tonight, he let someone else guide part of the procedure. It was difficult for him, but he understood that she was right. Together, they could handle this. The team worked tirelessly. The hidden bleeding was managed, and they cleaned the surgical area. The nurse directed small adjustments, made suggestions about fluid management, and ensured that the patient's vitals were monitored continuously. Every action she took was calculated, precise, and deliberate. She did not allow panic to creep in, even as the patient's life hung in the balance. Minutes passed in intense focus. The patient's vitals slowly began to improve. Her blood pressure was more stable, her pulse stronger. The nurse did not allow herself to relax fully yet. She continued to observe, to adjust, to anticipate any changes. The surgeon finally exhaled quietly. He had been holding his breath almost unconsciously. His hands still moved expertly, finishing the necessary procedures, but the tension in his shoulders had eased slightly. He looked at the nurse again, silently thanking her without words. He had learned something important. Experience and observation could be as vital as skill, and sometimes the quietest voice in a room could be the one that mattered most. Outside the operating room, the staff remained quietly aware of the situation. Some had begun to understand that the nurse, often overlooked, had played a critical role in managing the crisis. There was a quiet respect growing, though few could put into words yet. Inside, the nurse remained vigilant. She continued to monitor vitals, adjust medications, and anticipate needs. She spoke only when necessary, her words precise, guiding the team without fanfare. She understood the stakes, and she understood that she had to remain steady, even if the surgeon, the patient, and everyone else in the room felt the weight of fear. The patient's condition began to show small signs of recovery. Her color improved slightly, her pulse strengthened, her breathing became more regular. The nurse felt a small sense of relief, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Surgery was not yet complete, and she could not afford to let her guard down. The surgeon worked alongside her, finally able to trust in her guidance. The teamwork was seamless, almost instinctive. Each adjustment she made allowed him to focus on his own tasks, and together they moved the patient closer to stability. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the immediate danger was managed. The patient's bleeding had been controlled, and her vitals were holding steady. The nurse took a deep breath, but her attention never wavered. She continued to monitor the patient, ensuring that any small change could be addressed immediately. The surgeon stepped back for a brief moment, his face wet with sweat. He looked at the nurse, a mix of gratitude and awe in his eyes. She had remained calm when everyone else had been tense. She had seen what others had missed. She had guided the team through the most critical moments. The nurse returned his gaze, acknowledging the unspoken words. She did not need praise. Her focus remained on the patient, but she understood that something had changed. The surgeon, once distant and authoritative, now recognized her not just as a nurse, but as someone whose judgment and calm had saved a life. The surgery was not over yet, but the immediate crisis had passed. The tension in the room lessened slightly, though everyone remained alert. The nurse continued her work, ensuring that the patient remained stable and that every precaution was taken for the next steps. In that moment, the nurse understood the power of quiet observation, of steady hands, and of speaking up when it mattered most. She had seen fear, she had acted despite fear, and she had helped save a life. The recognition she received from the surgeon was not loud or public, but it was profound. And for the first time that night, she felt the weight of her experience acknowledged, even if silently. She returned her attention fully to the patient, ready for whatever came next, knowing that she had made a difference in a life that meant the world to someone else. That understanding, quiet but deep, stayed with her as the surgery continued, guiding her actions in the most human and necessary way possible. The operating room had finally reached a point of cautious calm. The patient was no longer in immediate danger, but she was far from out of the woods. Her vitals were stable enough to allow the team a brief moment of breathing, yet every second still mattered. Every member of the team felt the tension in the air, the weight of what had just happened, and the fear of what could still happen. The surgeon finally stepped back from the operating table. His hands were still skilled, moving with precision, but his shoulders had relaxed slightly. He had been holding more than just the weight of the surgery. He had been holding the fear of losing someone he loved. That fear had driven him forward, but it had also clouded his judgment for precious moments. Now, he understood how close they had come to disaster. The nurse had remained by the patient's side throughout, calm and precise, her focus unwavering. She checked every line, every monitor, every small indicator that might signal a change in condition. She adjusted medication drips, ensured that suction lines were clear, and quietly guided the junior staff in assisting the surgeons. Every move she made was deliberate, measured, and full of care. The room seemed to slow down, though no one spoke of it. The tension that had dominated the past hour lingered, but it was softer now, replaced with relief that the worst had been managed. Yet even in that relief, the nurse knew that the patient's recovery was only beginning. There was still work to do, but they had survived the most critical part. The surgeon walked toward the nurse's station, his eyes scanning the room. The staff had been silent for most of the procedure, focused on the patient and their own tasks. He finally stopped in front of the nurse who had guided them through the hidden dangers. For a moment, he simply looked at her. He saw the calm determination, the steady hands, and the sharp mind that had noticed what others had missed. He saw the quiet bravery that had spoken up when it mattered most. He realized that without her, the outcome could have been very different. He raised his voice, strong enough for the staff in the room to hear. "That's my wife, and you saved her life." The room fell silent. The words carried weight, more than anyone expected. Nurses and doctors alike stopped what they were doing and turned to see who he was addressing. Many had overlooked her for years, not realizing the depth of her skill and the strength of her judgment. Now, the most respected surgeon in the hospital was openly acknowledging her in front of everyone. The nurse felt a quiet wave of surprise, followed by humility. She did not seek recognition. She had done her job because she cared, because she could not imagine standing by and doing nothing. But hearing those words from him in that moment was something profound. It was acknowledgement not just of her actions, but of her dedication, her experience, and her courage. Other doctors nodded quietly, some in admiration, some in reflection. The younger nurses who had always looked up to her felt a sense of pride swell inside them. The atmosphere in the room had shifted, subtly but significantly. Respect had been earned not through loud announcements or authority, but through quiet, steady competence and courage. The surgeon's wife, still unconscious but stable, was being carefully moved to recovery. The nurse assisted with the transfer, her hands gentle, precise. She ensured that every tube, line, and monitor remained secure, knowing that even small errors could cause setbacks. She guided the team through the delicate process with the same calm focus she had maintained throughout the surgery. Once the patient was safely in recovery, the nurse stepped back, but she did not leave. She checked the charts, reviewed medication schedules, and confirmed that all follow-up procedures were in place. She communicated with the recovery team, ensuring that nothing was overlooked. Her attention to detail was meticulous, driven not by pride but by care. The surgeon remained nearby, observing, grateful but also deeply reflective. He realized how much he relied on her guidance, even without admitting it at first. He had allowed fear to cloud his decisions, and she had been the steady presence that prevented a tragedy. He understood, finally, that hierarchy and title could not replace observation, experience, and intuition. The staff began to settle into their routines again, but the impact of the evening lingered. People moved more thoughtfully, aware of the lesson they had witnessed. That courage and skill often come from unexpected places, and that listening, truly listening, can save lives. The nurse did not seek accolades. She remained calm, focused, and practical. She ensured that the recovery area was prepared, that monitoring protocols were followed, and that the patient would receive the best care possible in the hours to come. Her actions were quiet but essential, a reminder that heroism often takes the form of steady, thoughtful service rather than dramatic gestures. The surgeon finally approached her again. This time, his voice was softer, almost personal. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you tonight." She nodded quietly, accepting the gratitude without fanfare. She had done what she had trained to do, what she had always done, and it had made a difference. She understood that in medicine and in life, some of the most important actions are those done without expectation of reward. The staff around them felt a subtle shift in perspective. They had witnessed a rare and profound moment of teamwork, courage, and acknowledgement. It was a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of quiet competence. Even the junior doctors who had been hesitant to speak now understood the importance of paying attention, trusting observation, and valuing the contributions of every team member. As the night continued, the nurse remained at her post, ensuring that the patient's transition to recovery was smooth. She checked vitals, adjusted lines, and kept the team informed. She maintained the same calm focus that had guided the surgery, understanding that recovery was just as crucial as the procedure itself. The surgeon watched, still in awe of her skill and calm presence. He realized that this night had taught him more than any lecture or textbook could, that life often depends on quiet decisions made in critical moments, and that respect is earned not through authority, but through action. The nurse continued her work, her mind clear, her hand steady, and her heart quietly proud of the life she had helped save. The room remained serious, professional, and focused, but underneath it all, there was a new understanding. Everyone had learned something profound about courage, attention, and the human element that underlies every act of medicine. And in that quiet, steady way, the nurse prepared for the next steps, ready to ensure that the patient's recovery would continue smoothly and that the lessons of the night would not be forgotten. The night slowly began to settle, but the hospital never truly slept. The emergency room lights dimmed slightly as the intensity of the evening passed, yet the monitors continued their quiet, steady beeping. The patient was now in recovery, still unconscious, but her condition was stable. She had survived the critical moments, thanks to the teamwork, quick thinking, and calm presence of the nurse who had quietly guided the operation. The surgeon remained close, checking on his wife at intervals, observing her vitals, and ensuring the recovery team followed every protocol. Despite his immense experience and authority, he still felt the weight of fear and gratitude. He had been forced to confront something he rarely experienced: vulnerability. He had seen how quickly life could slip away, even under his own hands, and he knew that it was her quiet voice and steady judgment that had prevented disaster. The nurse continued her work in the recovery area, adjusting lines, monitoring vital signs, and communicating with the team to ensure every detail was accounted for. She moved with efficiency, her mind calm but alert. Her actions were quiet, almost invisible, yet every small adjustment mattered. The staff began to take notice in ways they had never before. Nurses who had always respected her quietly found new admiration for her skill. Junior doctors, who had often hesitated to ask questions, now approached her with confidence, seeking guidance and advice. Even senior doctors who had once dismissed her opinions began to pause and consider her observations with more seriousness. The surgeon approached her again, this time with a softness that had not been present before. He did not speak to the staff, did not make a public announcement, but looked her in the eyes and said, "I cannot thank you enough. You saved her. You saved my wife." The nurse nodded quietly, accepting his words without pride. She had done what needed to be done. Her focus had never been on recognition, only on action. Yet she understood the gravity of what had occurred, and she allowed herself a small, private sense of accomplishment. Word of the night's events began to ripple quietly through the hospital. Staff who had witnessed the operation or heard the story later shared it in whispers. No one exaggerated. No one saw drama. They simply acknowledged that a quiet, often overlooked nurse had made the difference between life and death for someone deeply important to a colleague. It was a story of courage, focus, and quiet heroism, and it left an impression on everyone who heard it. In the following days, the patient slowly regained consciousness. Her first moments were disoriented, but the nurses in recovery guided her gently, helping her understand what had happened. She asked about the surgery, about the events that had unfolded, and someone quietly mentioned the nurse who had guided the team to the critical moments. The patient insisted on meeting her. When they finally met, the nurse approached with her usual calm demeanor. She did not seek praise, but the gratitude in the patient's eyes was profound. They shared a quiet moment, not needing many words, just acknowledgement of the life that had been saved. The surgeon, standing nearby, watched with a mix of relief and admiration. He had been through countless procedures, but this night had taught him something more than technique. It had taught him the power of observation, the importance of listening, and the value of humility. He had seen firsthand that heroism did not always come from authority, but often from quiet, steadfast competence. In the weeks that followed, the nurse continued her work with the same dedication she always had. She did not seek attention, but the respect she earned could no longer be ignored. Staff began to consult her more frequently, valuing her judgment and insight. The culture in the hospital subtly shifted, as people realized that every voice mattered, every observation could be critical, and true teamwork depended on listening to everyone, regardless of their title. The surgeon took time to reflect on his own behavior. He had always valued skill and experience, but he realized that he had sometimes been too quick to dismiss the voices of those he underestimated. The events of that night changed him. He began to mentor his team differently, encouraging input from every member, fostering an environment where observation and intuition were respected alongside skill. The nurse remained humble. She continued to care for her patients, guide her colleagues, and maintain the steady focus that saved a life. She understood that her work was not about accolades, but about the quiet, consistent act of caring, of observing, and of acting when it mattered most. The patient fully recovered over time. She and the surgeon both expressed their profound gratitude privately and publicly in subtle ways, ensuring that the nurse's contribution was never forgotten. The bond between them was strengthened, not just by the survival of the patient, but by the recognition of the human courage and skill that had made survival possible. The story of that night became a quiet legend within the hospital. It was not told with exaggeration or drama, but with respect for the truth, that sometimes the person who seems unnoticed, the one who quietly observes and acts, can make the difference between life and death. The nurse had been overlooked for years, but in the moments that truly mattered, she had become the most important person in the room. And for her, the reward was not praise or recognition, but the knowledge that she had acted with clarity, courage, and compassion. She had saved a life. She had changed a family's world. And she had reminded everyone around her what truly mattered in medicine: attention, care, and the quiet courage to speak up when it counted most. The hospital returned to its usual rhythm, with new respect quietly embedded in its halls. Doctors, nurses, and staff carried with them the memory of that night, and the lesson it had taught them. The nurse continued her work with the same dedication, knowing that the smallest observations, the quietest words, and the calmest hands can have the most profound impact. And in the end, the night's events became more than just a story of emergency surgery. They became a testament to human courage, compassion, and the power of one person's focus to save a life.